The Stolen Children of Fair Hope. In the records rooms of Charleston, South Carolina, there exists a pattern that few have noticed. Between 1843 and 1851, 17 children were born in the slave quarters of 5 low-country plantations. Each child had skin pale as cotton and eyes the color of coastal waters. Within their first year of life, every single one vanished from the slave registries without explanation. No death certificates, no sale records, no trace. These children weren't freed. They weren't killed. They were transformed, given new identities and new families, then sold into white society for prices that exceeded a plantation's annual profit. The men who orchestrated these transactions have their names engraved on courthouse walls and street signs throughout South Carolina today, and the network they built was so carefully constructed that families on both sides, black and white, kept the secret for generations, knowing that one word could destroy everything. Fair Hope Plantation, 23 miles northwest of Charleston, where the Ashley River curved through marshland thick with cypress and live oak, sat Fair Hope Plantation. The main house overlooked 300 acres of rice fields that had made the Colson family wealthy enough to own 47 enslaved people by 1842. Thomas Colson had inherited Fair Hope at 29 when his father died of yellow fever. Unlike many plantation owners who preferred Charleston society, Thomas resided at Fair Hope year-round. His wife had died in childbirth, their daughter Margaret sent to live with Virginia relatives. Thomas never remarried. Neighbors considered him melancholic but fair, a man who kept to himself and ran his plantation with quiet efficiency. His overseer, Duncan Hayes, had worked at Fair Hope for 18 years, sharing his employer's preference for order over brutality, not from kindness, but because stable workforces produced better yields. Among the enslaved community lived a woman named Raina, 24 years old in the summer of 1843. She worked in the main house as a seamstress and occasional servant when guests visited. Born at Fair Hope like her mother and grandmother before her, Raina possessed what was called in coded language good features, lighter skin than many field workers, hazel eyes, hair that fell in loose waves. Her grandmother had been purchased from Barbados, bringing mixed heritage passed down through 3 generations. Raina could read, taught secretly by an elderly white tutor before the woman's death. She kept this skill carefully hidden, knowing the danger it represented. The first disappearance, in spring 1843, Raina became pregnant. She never spoke about the father, not to her mother, not to the other women in the quarters, not even to Ruth, her closest friend since childhood. When asked, she would turn away and continue her work. The other enslaved women understood what her silence meant. They had seen it before, that particular shame mixed with rage that came from violations that couldn't be discussed because there was no justice available, no authority to appeal to. Thomas Colson made no acknowledgement of Raina's condition. She continued working until her 7th month when Duncan Hayes reassigned her to lighter tasks. In December 1843, Raina gave birth to a daughter. Diana, the midwife who had delivered 43 children at Fair Hope over 20 years, later told her husband she had nearly cried out when she first saw the infant. The child's skin was pale, not light brown, but pale enough to be mistaken for white in certain light. Her eyes, when they opened 2 days later, were distinctly blue. Raina named her daughter Lily and for 3 months kept her hidden as much as possible, claiming the baby was sickly. But secrets were impossible in the close confines of the quarters. Word spread quickly about Lily's unusual appearance. Thomas Colson first saw Lily in March 1844 when Raina brought the infant to the main house. He studied the baby for a long moment, his face revealing nothing, then told Raina to continue her work. He said nothing about Lily's appearance. He asked no questions. That night, he sent for Duncan Hayes. The 2 men met in Thomas's study until well past midnight. 3 weeks later, a man arrived who introduced himself as Samuel Porter, a textile merchant from Colombia. He spent 2 days at the plantation, ostensibly discussing business, though no fabric shipments arrived. Porter was seen walking through the quarters with Duncan Hayes, taking notes in a small leather journal. He looked at the children, all of them, with attention that made their mothers uneasy. Before leaving, Porter spent an hour alone with Thomas Coulson. He departed carrying a sealed envelope and a promise of regular correspondence. Lily was 6 months old when she disappeared. It happened in June 1844, during weather so hot and still that even insects seemed to move slowly. Rayner rose before dawn, as always, nursed Lily, changed her clothes, and laid her in the wooden cradle used for 3 generations. Ruth had promised to check on the baby throughout the day. At mid-morning, Ruth found the cabin empty. The cradle was there, the blanket still warm, but Lily was gone. Cold panic spread through the quarters, the kind of fear that came not from mystery but from terrible understanding. Ruth ran to the main house. The words spilled out. Lily was gone. No one had seen anything. Rayner dropped the shirt she'd been mending and ran. By the time she reached the quarters, 7 women were searching, calling Lily's name, checking every cabin, every shed, every shadowed space. Duncan Hayes appeared within 20 minutes, organizing a methodical search of the entire plantation. Field workers were pulled from their labor. The search continued until nightfall. Lily was not found. Thomas Coulson spoke to Rayner once, briefly in the early evening. He stood on the back steps, while she stood in the yard below, face streaked with tears and dirt. He told her every effort was being made. He suggested that perhaps an animal had gotten into the cabin. There were foxes, alligators in the marshes. Rayner knew her daughter had not been taken by an animal. No signs of struggle, no blood, no torn fabric. Lily had been lifted from her cradle and carried away by human hands directed by Thomas Coulson. She said nothing. What could she say? Who would she tell? For 3 days, Rayner barely moved. She lay on her narrow bed, staring at the empty cradle, her body still producing milk, her arms aching with emptiness. On the 4th day, Rayner rose before dawn, washed in cold water, and returned to work. Duncan Hayes, surprised, asked if she was fit for labor. She told him she was. She picked up her needle and thread and began mending Thomas Coulson's shirts with mechanical precision. She never spoke Lily's name again, not to Ruth, not to her mother, not even to herself. It was as if the child had been erased from existence, the transformation. But Lily had not been erased. She had been transformed, 200 miles away, in a well-appointed home on a tree-lined Columbia Street. Charlotte and Robert Brennan welcomed a new addition to their family. The lawyer and his wife had been unable to have children, a source of quiet sorrow in their 10-year marriage. Samuel Porter, Robert's cousin and business associate, had approached them with an unusual proposition. He knew of an infant girl recently orphaned who needed a home. The circumstances were delicate, requiring absolute discretion. The child's parentage was complicated, but she was healthy, beautiful, and available for a price that would cover all legal arrangements. Charlotte and Robert asked few questions. The social world they inhabited was built on carefully maintained fictions. They understood how to accept convenient stories without examining foundations too closely. 3 weeks after Lily's disappearance, a carriage arrived at their home carrying a 6-month-old girl with pale skin and blue eyes. They named her Sarah, claimed she was the orphaned daughter of Robert's late brother from a private marriage, and registered her birth with carefully falsified documents. A sympathetic clerk, compensated generously, filed the papers without question. Sarah Brennan became, in every legal and social sense, a white child born to a white family. The transaction left no paper trail. The money changed Anne's invisibly, and Lily, the enslaved infant born to Rayner at Fairhope, ceased to exist in any traceable record. She was the first, but not the last. The network expands. Over the next 7 years, 16 more children were born in slave quarters across 5 different low-country plantations. The plantations weren't neighbors. They ranged from Beaufort County to Georgetown, distances of 60 miles or more, but they shared certain characteristics. Each was prosperous and well-established. Each was owned by families with connections to Charleston's merchant and legal communities. Each employed the same lawyer, Robert Brennan. The children, like Lily, were born with skin pale enough to pass for white. Their mothers, without exception, were light-skinned enslaved women who worked in or near the main houses. And like Lily, each child disappeared within the first year of life, vanishing with no explanation, no record, no trace. The pattern wasn't immediately obvious because the plantations were separate, and enslaved communities had no way to communicate across those distances. A mother, losing a child in Beaufort, had no way to know that another mother in Georgetown had experienced the same disappearance 3 months earlier. The grief was isolated, contained, unable to spread or form a larger picture. But Duncan Hayes knew, as overseer at Fair Hope, he had witnessed Lily's disappearance and understood its true nature. Over the following years, as he traveled to other plantations on business for Thomas Colson, he heard whispered stories matching what had happened to Rayna's child, an infant gone in the night, a distraught mother given no answers, a white visitor shortly before the disappearance. Hayes kept careful notes in a personal journal hidden beneath a floorboard in his quarters. He wasn't moved by moral outrage. He'd spent 23 years overseeing enslaved labor and had made peace with required brutalities. His interest was simpler. He believed he was witnessing something unprecedented, and his instinct for self-preservation told him that documenting it might someday prove valuable. By 1849, his journal contained descriptions of 9 disappearances, including dates, plantation names, physical descriptions, and the repeated appearance of certain names: Samuel Porter, Robert Brennan, and a doctor named Horace Strickland. A mother's demand. In December 1849, a 10th child was born at Fair Hope, a boy named Joseph, born to a woman named Catherine who worked in the kitchen. Like Lily, Joseph had pale skin and blue eyes. Catherine understood immediately what his appearance meant. She'd heard whispered stories about Rayna's daughter. Though Rayna never spoke of Lily again, Ruth had told the story to others, and it had circulated through the quarters in the careful, coded way dangerous information traveled. Catherine knew Joseph would disappear. She knew there was nothing she could do to prevent it. But unlike Rayna, Catherine decided she wouldn't suffer in silence. 2 weeks before Joseph's disappearance, Catherine did something that could have gotten her whipped or worse. She sought out Duncan Hayes and spoke to him directly, without being addressed first. She made a demand. She told Hayes she knew what was going to happen to her son. She told him she knew he was part of it, that he kept records, that he had knowledge of where the children went. And she told him that if Joseph was taken, she wanted proof, some object, some token, something belonging to her son that could be returned as evidence that he lived. She didn't ask for her son back. She understood that was impossible. She asked only for proof that he existed somewhere beyond her reach. Hayes stared at her for a long moment. No enslaved person had ever spoken to him with such directness. The reasonable response would have been punishment, reasserting absolute authority. Instead, he nodded once, turned, and walked away. 3 weeks later, Joseph disappeared from his cradle. Catherine made no outcry. She didn't search or weep or collapse. She returned to work and said nothing. A week after Joseph's disappearance, Catherine found a small wooden button on her cabin floor, carved from pale wood, far too fine for enslaved people's garments. She recognized it immediately. She had sewn it onto the small shirt she'd made for Joseph, using fabric scraps from the main house. Catherine placed the button in a small cloth pouch and hid it in a crevice in the tabby wall. It was no her child, but it was proof. Joseph had existed. He had been taken, but he had lived. Duncan Hayes never spoke to Catherine again about what he'd done. But his action represented a crack in the system's machinery, a moment where someone with power acknowledged, however minimally, the humanity of someone without it. The network at its peak. Between 1850 and 1851, 6 more children were born and subsequently disappeared. The network had become efficient. Time between birth and disappearance shortened to as little as 3 weeks. White families receiving these children grew confident in their legal protections. Falsified birth records became easier to produce as more clerks and officials were brought into the conspiracy through payment or coercion. Robert Brennan had established relationships with 7 families across South Carolina and Georgia, willing to pay between $800 and $1,500 for a child who could pass as white. The amounts were staggering. A skilled enslaved person might sell for $1,200. But these transactions involved infants who wouldn't provide labor for years and required extensive legal manipulation. Samuel Porter coordinated logistics, traveling between plantations, identifying candidates, arranging timing, handling transportation. Dr. Horace Strickland provided medical documentation, certifying children's health, and more importantly, creating birth certificates and vaccination records establishing false identities. By late 1851, 17 children had been prosees. Said through this network. They lived in homes across the South, attending schools, learning to read and write, growing up with all the privileges of whiteness denied to their mothers. None knew where they came from. The secret was kept not just by white families who'd purchased these children, but by enslaved mothers who'd lost them. Speaking about what happened was dangerous and pointless. There was no authority to appeal to, no law that would acknowledge their loss as crime. The children hadn't died, but they were gone just as completely. The network fractures. In March 1852, Duncan Hayes became ill. What started as a persistent cough and fever worsened within 2 weeks. Thomas Coulson sent for a Charleston doctor. The diagnosis was consumption, tuberculosis. The prognosis was grim. By June, Hayes could barely speak above a whisper. In late June, he asked to speak privately with Thomas Coulson. When Thomas arrived, Hayes gestured toward the loose floorboard where he'd hidden his journal. Thomas read the journal that night by lamplight. Hayes had documented every disappearance in detail: dates, mothers' names, physical descriptions, references to Porter, Brennan, and Strickland, notes about approximate money amounts based on overheard conversations. The journal wasn't complete, but it contained enough specific information to be catastrophically dangerous. If abolitionists obtained it, if federal investigators discovered it, the consequences would extend far beyond Thomas Coulson. This wasn't just violation of moral codes many white Southerners overlooked. It was fraud, falsification of legal documents, conspiracy implicating South Carolina's most prominent families. Thomas asked Hayes why he'd kept such records. Hayes, voice barely audible, said he'd wanted proof of something extraordinary. He'd spent his life enforcing a brutal system and thought himself beyond surprise. But the child trafficking had revealed new depths of what people would do with absolute power. He'd wanted a record. He'd wanted someone to know. Facing death, Hayes offered Thomas a deal. Thomas could have the journal if he would deliver a sealed letter to Catherine. Hayes wouldn't reveal the letter's contents, but promised it wouldn't threaten the network. It was, he said, a personal matter. Thomas agreed, though he had no intention of honoring the promise. He took the journal and burned it that night, watching pages curl and blacken. He kept windows closed despite the heat to ensure no fragment could escape. Duncan Hayes died 3 days later, July 4, 1852. He was buried in a small plantation cemetery with a simple stone. No service was held. The letter and the knowledge, the letter Hayes had written to Catherine, remained sealed in Thomas's desk for 2 weeks. Finally, curiosity prevented him from burning it. He broke the seal and read, The letter contained an address in Columbia, 134 Westfield Avenue, a name, Sarah Brennan. Below that, one line, "Your daughter lives." The button I returned came from her clothing. Thomas read the letter 3 times, stomach tightening. Hayes had discovered where Lily had been placed. The information could only have come from Porter or Brennan. The network had been compromised, and Hayes, in his final act, had chosen to arm enslaved mother with knowledge that could unravel everything. Thomas burned the letter as he'd burned a journal, but he understood that destroying paper didn't eliminate knowledge. Hayes might have told Catherine already. The information existed now in human memory where it could spread beyond control. What Thomas didn't know was that Catherine already possessed all the information in Hayes's letter. Hayes had spoken to her twice before his death when Thomas had been away on business. He'd told her where Lily had been taken. More importantly, he'd told her how the entire network operated, the plantations involved, the white men coordinating transactions, approximate locations where other children had been placed. Hayes had shared this for reasons he didn't fully understand himself. Perhaps guilt as death approached. Perhaps desire to create chaos in a system he'd spent his life enforcing. Perhaps simple spite against wealthy men who'd profited while he'd taken risks for modest salary. Whatever the motivation, Hayes had given Catherine something extraordinary: knowledge. The counter-archive. Catherine did nothing immediately. She understood any direct action would result in death or sale. She couldn't travel to Columbia, couldn't write letters, couldn't approach authorities. But Catherine did something far more dangerous to the network than immediate action, she told the other mothers. One by one, carefully and in absolute secrecy, she shared what Hayes had revealed. Raina learned that Lily lived in Columbia as Sarah Brennan. Hannah learned her son lived in Charleston, renamed Michael Garrison. Clara learned her daughter had been taken to Savannah, Georgia, now called Anna Whitfield. The mothers couldn't reclaim their children, couldn't reveal the truth, but they possessed the knowledge, and they passed it to each other like precious contraband, creating a counter-archive to replace the journal Thomas Colson had burned. Each woman memorized names and addresses, repeated them silently, rehearsed them in their minds, ensured the information wouldn't be lost. This archive had no purpose beyond its own preservation. The mothers had no illusions about justice or reunion, but the knowledge itself became a form of resistance, proof that their children had existed, that crimes had been committed, that history wouldn't be entirely controlled by those with power to write official records.